Hello, everyone. Sorry. Let me go back. All right. So this is part two, the Washington Presidency in 1 hour. Excuse me. American Story, U.S. History Documentaries. So I was reading a little bit before I started on this one. Documentaries of people profiles. I was scrolling down and I saw this one, the people profile. So this is the same thing. All right. This is longer for some reason, though. Anyways, it's not going to deter us. In fact, get your popcorn and your fake butter spray if you have any, like I do. Oh, yeah. We're about to enjoy. So, kick back, get ready. You can give a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. That helps. You can donate to the channel through the thanks button. It's your choice. If you do, request a video and I'll react to it. Okay? This is going to be another 23 minutes. So let's get into it.
Of Liberty boarded a merchant ship belonging to the East India Company and dumped its valuable cargo of tea into Boston Harbor. While Washington was dismayed by the protest, he was furious at the British response, which involved passing a number of draconian measures against Boston, collectively known as the Intolerable Acts, the most important of which closed the port of Boston to trade until the East India Company was compensated for the loss of cargo. In the House of Burgesses, Washington supported an initiative to show solidarity with Boston by convening a Congress of all 13 colonies to protect their collective rights. In July 1774, while chairing a meeting in Fairfax County, which he had represented since 1765, Washington passed the Fairfax Resolves, which he had drafted alongside George Mason, asserting that taxation and representation are in their nature inseparable. Washington thus became one of the leading advocates of resistance against Britain, and on the 5th of August he was elected to Virginia's 7-man delegation to the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia, which would meet the following month. Surrounded by some of the finest orators of the day, Washington spoke rarely but effectively, bringing together different viewpoints. As the delegates were increasingly convinced that war would break out, Washington's name was on many of their lips when it came to a commander-in-chief. The 42-year-old Washington had developed a sense of political maturity that had been absent in his younger days, and did not actively lobby for the command, confident that his reputation would be enough to secure the post. For the time being, the Continental Congress was content to set up a continental association to coordinate efforts among the colonies to ban trade with Great Britain. On the 19th of April 1775, British redcoats and American militiamen exchanged fire at Concord and Lexington in Massachusetts, marking the outbreak of the American Revolutionary War. Washington had already secured election to the Second Continental Congress, which opened on the 10th of May, with the agenda firmly focused on raising militia and volunteers across the colonies. Washington appeared in the Congress wearing his colonel's uniform, and his expertise in military affairs was in high demand among his fellow delegates. On the 14th of June, the Congress assumed control of the volunteer army, laying siege to the British forces in Boston under the command of General Thomas Gage, thereby creating the Continental Army, and Washington was appointed General and Commander-in-Chief of the Army of the United Colonies on the 16th. While on his way to take command of the Continentals in Boston, Washington received news of the Battle of Bunker Hill on the 17th of June, where 2,000 men under General William Howe successfully captured the American positions, but at the cost of 1,000 casualties, demonstrating that the Continentals were more than capable of putting up a fight. Upon arriving in Boston,
The British lost 1,000. The Americans lost 400. And someone in Parliament, I apologize, I don't remember the name, they were told yeah, we won the battle. And the person saw the amount of casualties compared to the other side. And they made this sarcastic thing in Parliament that said, yeah, a couple more victories like that, and we won't have another military left. Or we won't have any more soldiers left, something like that. And it's like, yeah, you can take those victories, but you can't take those losses. So it's not really a victory. Yeah, it's kind of a, did we win?
Washington sought to instill in his men the idea that they were a national army rather than from a collection of states. Upon inspecting his army, he was disappointed to find that he only had 14,000 men fit for duty living in poor conditions, while supplies of gunpowder were dangerously low. Fearing British spies, he kept quiet about these deficiencies to all but his closest confidants. During this period, the Commander-in-Chief came to be particularly close to Brigadier General Nathaniel Greene from Rhode Island, as well as 25-year-old artillery commander Colonel Henry Knox, a Boston bookseller who had learned everything about military affairs from the books and the British officers he talked to in his shop. Washington struggled in his efforts to create a professional standing army. Recruits were authorized to serve for 1 year, with the effect that no sooner had they been trained and drilled to fight effectively, they would melt away and return to their homes. As he faced losing his entire army on the 1st of January 1776, Washington attempted to persuade the men to re-enlist, but fewer than 10,000 would agree to do so by the end of the year. In order to bolster numbers, Washington considered recruiting from the black population. While black soldiers had fought in the ranks of the volunteers in Massachusetts and were considered every bit as brave as their white counterparts, as a leading figure of Virginia's slaveholding class, the thought of arming black men raised the prospect of slave rebellion. At a war council in October, Washington prohibited any black soldiers from serving in the Continental Army, but upon hearing that Virginia's governor, Lord Dunmore, had promised to free slaves who were to join the British Army, Washington compromised and allowed free blacks to serve in his ranks, who would make up around 10% of the Continental Army. As winter approached, Washington realized he could not abandon his army and return to Mount Vernon, and instead invited his wife Martha to stay with him. Martha Washington would spend half the war with her husband on campaign, serving as a trusted confidant for his concerns and anxieties about his army and the war. The condition Washington's men found themselves in during the first winter of the war caused morale to plummet, leading the men to question if their cause could ever succeed. The politicians in Philadelphia were still split on whether to declare independence, and some still believed in petitioning King George III and reconciling with Britain. The publication of Thomas Paine's pamphlet Common Sense in January 1776 highlighted the tyrannical power of monarchy and galvanized the movement for independence. Spirits further increased on the 17th of January when Henry Knox arrived after accomplishing the incredible logistical feat of hauling almost 60 pieces of cannon from Fort Ticonderoga in New York near the Canadian border across the December snows to Washington's camp. Although Washington still lacked the powder for a full assault on Boston, he successfully maneuvered the cannon onto the Dorchester Heights overlooking the city during the course of a single night on the 4th of March, leaving the British with no choice but to evacuate. Having captured Boston without losing a single man, Washington hurried to New York, believing that General Howe would attempt to take the city. Although the city's geography made it difficult to defend from the British Army, and there was a large population of loyalists sympathizing with the British, Washington recognized the political and commercial importance to the Continental cause and felt compelled to make a stand despite being significantly outnumbered. Meanwhile, the drumbeat for independence was sounding ever louder, and the Declaration of Independence drafted by Thomas Jefferson, Washington's colleague in the Virginia House of Burgesses,
in office 1808 to 1809. So he was only president for a year. think they made a boo-boo. I think they made a boo-boo.
Drafted by Thomas Jefferson, Washington's colleague in the Virginia House of Burgesses, was adopted by Congress on the 4th of July 1776 and was received with wild enthusiasm by the Continental Army when Washington read the declaration to them on the 8th. The enthusiasm was premature, as the British Army and Navy, commanded by brothers William and Richard Howe, soon descended on New York at the head of 32,000 men and 70 warships, keen to defeat the rebellion once and for all. By mid-August, Washington had 23,000 men under his command, but most were inexperienced recruits. Meanwhile, when the British landed 2/3 of their force at Long Island, Washington misread it as a diversion and only sent 6,000 men to defend the Brooklyn Heights to the west of the island, keeping most of his men in Manhattan. On the 26th, the Continentals were surrounded by the British, with 300 killed and 1,000 captured. But on the night of the 29th of August, Washington took advantage of Howe's reluctance to stage a full pursuit by evacuating all the men from Long Island to Manhattan. The commander himself was on the last boat across the East River, shrouded from the British by thick fog. A few days later, Washington withdrew from the city to the north. The Continentals had built Fort Washington and Fort Lee overlooking the Hudson River, but these were taken by the British in November, forcing the Continentals to flee across to New Jersey. These setbacks also called into question Washington's command abilities, and his subordinate, General Charles Lee, schemed to replace him. Upon discovering the plot, Washington said nothing to Lee, who received his comeuppance in mid-December when he was captured by the British. Washington's Continental Army was a bedraggled group of fewer than 4,000 men when it crossed the Delaware River to Pennsylvania, while Howe's army was in striking range of Philadelphia, forcing the Continental Congress to evacuate to Baltimore. With little to lose and with a few thousand extra reinforcements under General Horatio Gates, Washington planned a daring operation back across the Delaware to surprise 3 regiments of Hessian mercenaries stationed in Trenton, New Jersey. Washington planned to cross the river on the night of Christmas Day in order to surprise the enemy, whom he expected to be drunk at the time. Despite a fierce snowstorm, which meant his main column of 2,400 men only got to the other side of the river by 4 in the morning on the 26th, Washington pressed on to Trenton. Although the Hessians were sober, they failed to believe that Washington would attempt such a daring operation in such foul weather. The element of surprise.
To be fair, they didn't think anyone was stupid enough to try a river crossing or anything like that, let alone Washington. Unfortunately for them, he was crazy enough to try it.
And the effectiveness of Henry Knox's artillery, combined with Washington's effective use of terrain to beat back a counterattack, obliged the Hessians to surrender. The Continentals killed and wounded 100 Hessians and captured 900 more, all for the loss of fewer than 10 men. While Washington is usually considered a defensive general who avoided battle with the odds against him, he was capable of some of the most daring attacks in the history of warfare. The success at Trenton was followed up by a similarly lopsided victory at Princeton a few days later, enabling Washington's men to push forward and expel the British almost completely from New Jersey. The victories provided a boost to morale and allowed Congress to move back to Philadelphia, but with only a few thousand men, Washington was obliged to remain on the defensive, launching frequent raids into enemy territory. In March 1777, the 22-year-old artillery captain Alexander Hamilton joined Washington's staff as aide-de-camp. The talented Hamilton was able to handle much of the commander-in-chief's correspondence and would later become his chief aide. At the end of July, Washington welcomed to his side the Marquis de Lafayette, a 20-year-old French aristocrat who shared in the political ideals of the American Revolution and defied a royal order to travel to America and volunteer his service to the cause. With Lafayette at his side, Washington and Congress hoped that France would be persuaded to join an alliance with the nascent United States. During the first half of 1777, Washington remained on the defensive and awaited Howe's movements. By the end of August, the British commander landed on the Chesapeake Bay and marched on Philadelphia. Keen not to lose the capital without a fight, Washington hurried to cut him off and deployed his army amongst the ravines of Brandywine Creek on the southwestern approaches of the city, anticipating a decisive battle. On the 11th of September, Howe launched his attack, sending 5,000 Hessians to attack Washington's main defensive position in a frontal assault, while he led a force of more than 8,000 men on a long flanking maneuver, aiming to cross the Brandywine at a couple of undefended forts. While the Continentals held firm against the frontal assault, by midday Washington wondered about the whereabouts of the main enemy force, and soon began to receive reports of an enemy flanking maneuver. The American commander realized that he had been outwitted and galloped to the sector in question to find 2 brigades of redcoats, not realizing that Howe's entire force was on its way. By 4 in the afternoon, 3 columns of British troops were thrown into the attack, routing the Continentals. At the end of the battle, the Continentals sustained more than 1,000 casualties, including 400 captured, while British casualties were half the number. The defeat at Brandywine resulted in the British occupation of Philadelphia, forcing Congress to evacuate again, this time to Trenton. Although the Continentals had fought bravely at Brandywine, once again Washington's failure to prepare adequately and his inability to respond quickly when the battle did not unfold as planned resulted in catastrophe for the American cause. The American commander was not disheartened, and on the 3rd of October, less than a month after Brandywine, Washington planned a daring night attack on Howe's camp at Germantown, hoping to repeat his heroics at Trenton the previous winter. However, this time round, Washington's plans unraveled in the middle of the night, and he was forced to abandon the attack after sustaining twice as many casualties as the British once again. He tried his best.
They lost so many people trying to get past that house, and there were so many British tied up in the house, they ended up going around it, but they tried so long to get the British out of that house, which they were using as kind of like a little spotting house. That was ice in my drink, sorry. Yeah, it just backfired on him.
To make light of the defeat in reports to Congress, and his audacious attack demonstrated to the British that there was still a lot of fight left in the battered and bruised Continental Army. While Washington's main army had suffered a series of setbacks against General Howe on the 17th of October, General Horatio Gates had defeated and captured a British army of 5,000 men under General John Burgoyne at Saratoga in New York, which had been attempting to march south to join Howe. While Washington welcomed the news of Gates' stunning victory, he felt threatened by a subordinate who had previously been a critic and whom he believed was seeking the supreme command for himself. These fears were confirmed when Gates was named as the president of the Congressional Board of War, giving him supervisory powers over Washington and his army. The Board of War also appointed.
To be fair, I think that when they appointed Washington, I think they thought that he was going to whip the soldiers into shape and go out and win wars. They didn't realize just how bad a shape a lot of the soldiers were, the lack of supplies, the lack of weapons, the overall mentality of a lot of soldiers. You're fighting the British. For the longest time, they were the dominant force. I mean, it's got to scare the hell out of you. You got to be fair when you're judging this. Washington, I mean, what was his record? 3-6 or 3-9? 3-6, I think, in battles. That's not a great record, but he knew after a while he couldn't do what the British were capable of doing. He had to fight and almost try to prolong the war to get the French involved. But those 3 victories that he had were massive victories. The losses clearly are never good, but when they put Lee in charge, it was because some of them really wanted Lee. They felt that he would be better. But they were looking at Washington, and they were politicians not understanding, they're over here. And they're not understanding, well, why isn't he doing this? Well, you're also, and it's also the politicians can only do so much in terms of ordering supplies. Somebody has to have them. Somebody has to make them. Somebody needs money for all that. It was just a bad condition all around. And, to be fair, I understand why they put Lee in charge. Maybe a spark. Maybe they felt he'd be better. Maybe they were hoping Washington would have been better. There's so many things, and none of them are good. It all worked out in the end.
With General Thomas Conway as Inspector General, with extensive powers over training and discipline, which bypassed Washington, promoting him to Major General in the process. When Conway arrived at Washington's camp at Valley Forge to announce his appointment, the commander was incensed and informed Conway that his generals would not recognize his authority, obliging Congress to send Conway elsewhere. Washington had stood firm, retained his command, and increased his authority. Washington's quarters for the winter of 1777 to 78.
I also want to say, if I'm in Washington's position and I have Lee, who thinks he's better, I was at the Conway Cabal, where, hold on. And then you have all these people who are secretly trying to destroy his career because they wanted to take over. Why do I forget a name? Why do I forgot a name? I just said that to myself. Charles Lee. Oh. I forgot some other names. Anyways, the way Washington went about that whole situation, all the backstabbing, where he just didn't say anything. He let them dig their own graves in a way. Not at all how I would have handled it. I would have been a detriment to the military, because I would have become enraged. I probably would have done and said things that I shouldn't have, and probably even said, hey, look, we're going to go into this next battle, right? Charles Lee's going to be there. If one of you accidentally shoots him 300 or 400 times, it is what it is, right? I would have been terrible. I would not have handled it well.
At Valley Forge, 20 miles to the northwest of Philadelphia, has entered into American legend. For yet another winter, the Continental Army was in a desperate state and risked falling apart, with thousands of men sick, hungry, cold, and demoralized. Washington's efforts to beg Congress for supplies came to nothing, and he came to realize that the existing Constitution, the Articles of Confederation, which left most political power with individual states, gave Congress little power and undermined his efforts to create a national army. Yet Washington's presence at the camp helped to keep his men together in these trying times when other armies may have melted away. while Martha Washington's care and attention for the men won her respect and affection throughout the ranks. Washington was also helped by the arrival of Friedrich von Steuben, a Prussian officer who had served in Frederick the Great's armies during the 7 Years' War. The Prussian army.
He may not have been all that he said he was, but he was everything that we needed in that moment. So when I applaud, I'm applauding that he was a savior. He was a savior because how he trained everyone over that winter. I would love to have been there just to hear his cursing at people and broken English and stuff like that. Like, that would have been great. I would have probably been scared to death of him at that time just because who's this guy Washington's bringing in? And then immediately he's just dropping F-bombs. I'd have been like, okay. Because back then, you didn't do that. You were more prim and proper. You're like, hi, how are you? Blah, 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 blah. This is all you hear. Beep, 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 beep. And then I'm going to shove it up your beep, 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 beep. And you're like, okay. All right. Is this guy going to kill me? Oh, he's here to train me. Well, I know what happens if I screw up. I'm going to get beep, 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 shoved up my beep, 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 and turned sideways.
The army was considered the best in Europe, famous for its discipline and order, attributes which the Continentals sorely lacked. Within a matter of weeks, Steuben drilled the army in line and column formations and associated maneuvers, and also began working on a drill manual, which would remain in use by the United States Army for almost a century. By the beginning of March, Washington had 12,000 men at his disposal, ready for action. A far more significant boost to the American war effort came in the form of a...
Okay, sorry about that. My dog was about to roll and knock over one of my lights. Back to the video, sorry.
An alliance with France, signed in Paris on the 6th of February 1778. The alliance changed the strategic picture of the war, forcing the British troops under their new commander Sir Henry Clinton to withdraw from Philadelphia to New York and attach 8,000 men to defend the West Indies from the French. While Clinton's men were on the retreat, Washington ordered General Charles Lee, recently released in a prisoner exchange, to take up his previous role as second-in-command, to lead a vanguard of 5,000 men against the British at Monmouth Court House. Lee, who had advised against the operation, launched a half-hearted attack that was easily repulsed by the British, sending the Continentals reeling and inviting a counterattack. A furious Washington rallied his reserve of 6,000 men and managed to turn the tide of the battle during 2 hours of fierce fighting. Washington decided against sending his exhausted army to pursue the British, who managed to slip away to safety in the middle of the night. In the weeks following the battle, General Lee was court-martialed and found guilty, and Washington was happy to see the back of him. For the next 3 years, the British forces turned their attention to the south. During this period, Washington would not fight a major battle, though he was by no means inactive. In the summer of 1778, the French Navy sailed up the Chesapeake to join Washington, though the cooperation between the subjects of an absolute monarchy and the citizens of a revolutionary republic was far from seamless, as the Americans realized that the French were motivated foremost by animosity against the British rather than support for the American cause, and once again Washington found himself interacting with European military officers who looked down on Americans and rarely kept him updated on their whereabouts. The following summer, Washington managed to stop Clinton from controlling the Hudson River and cutting off New England from the rest of the United States, but this period otherwise proved uneventful. By 1780, Washington's army was low on money and supplies, and military success seemed impossible without the assistance of the French. Lafayette had been in France since the beginning of 1779 and lobbied for greater French assistance to the American cause. King Louis XVI answered the call by sending an expeditionary force of 6,000 men to America.
I'll say it because I've said it before. I am related to King Louis XVI of France. So I just like to point out that it's really nice to see him, with this thing still connected. '54 to '93. So he. Wait a minute. He wasn't even. He was 39. I had a shot in me. All right. I had a shot. I had a couple. Okay, I had 2 shots in me. But he was only 39. Am I doing the math right on that? Please tell me I'm. Because 94 would be 40. So he was 39 when he died. Why does it feel like he was older than that? He was 39 when he died? Are we seriously? Wow. Okay. Wow. 39. So 76. Oh, he came in 74. Okay, so he was 20. So, wow. Okay. So he came in 74. The America and the British started kind of kicking off little issues in 75. Well, let me go back. It was pretty much since the end of the French and Indian War, or 7 Years' War, which was, what was that, 58 to 65? We'll say 65. So, 65. Okay, so he was 11, so he wouldn't have known a whole lot about that. But from about 11 until 20, he's hearing the back and forth starting. Then he takes over. As he's taken over is pretty much the kickoff of the actual war. Wow, he was young when all that happened, wasn't he? He was 20 years old, and yet, well, he would have been, let's say 75 is kind of the a start of everything. So he's 21 years old. How many of you at 21 would have had the foresight to fund another a colony's revolution against, granted it was your enemy? I wouldn't have. I would have. Maybe I would have. I don't think I would have. Maybe, but I don't think I would have. I didn't realize just how young he was when everything. Wow. Wow. Okay. Back to the video.
America under the command of the Comte de Rochambeau, in conjunction with the fleet commanded by the Chevalier de Ternay, who landed in Newport, Rhode Island on the 10th of July 1780. Meanwhile, the Continentals had suffered a series of setbacks in the South, beginning with the loss of the port of Charleston in South Carolina in May, and followed by Horatio Gates' defeat to General Charles Cornwallis at the Battle of Camden.
Horatio Gates. That was the other one with Charles Lee. Although Gates, I don't think was as much, but Gates was a former British he was in the military. Was he in the Navy? No. I don't know anything about Gates. I don't know enough about Horatio Gates. My apologies to Mr. Gates, whether you're up or down. I'm sorry. But yeah, Gates was a British guy. But Gates was one of, you know what? Pause. Okay. Horatio Gates, 1727 to 1806, was a British-born American Army officer who served. Was a British. Okay, I just read that and it's the shot. I apologize. Was a British-born American Army officer who served as a general in the Continental Army. He took credit for the American victory in the Battle of Saratoga. Well, of course he did. Everybody. Oh, okay, yeah. Because, Gates has been described as one of the revolution's most controversial military figures because of his role in the Conway Cabal, which attempted to discredit and replace General Washington. Okay. Maybe Charles Lee was not involved in that. Maybe that's I was thinking of him. I like to make sure that my facts are correct. Charles Lee. I want to make sure my facts are correct when I'm saying stuff on the video, because I don't want it to, because if I say something wrong and you don't know, then you go with it and then somebody corrects you and then you're like, well, that guy's full of garbage. And I don't want that to happen. I want to, because I don't always know. Hold on. Let me apologize. I'm going to pause it so you don't have to listen to the ramblings. I paused it and then 4 seconds later unpaused it. Yes, Charles Lee was involved in the Conway Cabal, a movement that opposed George Washington's leadership during the American Revolutionary War. Lee was an English Army veteran who criticized Washington's leadership. Okay. So they were both involved. All right, Horatio Gates. That's who I couldn't think of. My apologies. What is that? The hell was that? I got blue dust on my finger and I don't know where blue dust came from. I'm not drunk. Am I dying? I'm not drunk or I don't know what's happening right now. Am I drunk? Back to the video.
In South Carolina on the 16th of August, whose dismissal by Congress in the aftermath of the debacle removed the final challenger to Washington's authority in the Continental Army. Worse was to follow in late September, when Washington belatedly recognized the treachery of Benedict Arnold, the courageous Continental Army officer who had fought with distinction at Saratoga, but had been nursing a wounded ego after being overlooked for promotion. In August, Arnold had been appointed commandant of the vital strategic fort of West Point, but rather than strengthen his defenses, he plotted to surrender it to the British, managing to escape just in time when the plot was discovered.
Benedict Arnold, I feel two ways. It's like this. I feel sad for him because he really was such a great war hero. He was so good. And yet how do I say it? His personality, his attitude, the way he spoke really rubbed people the wrong way. And unfortunately, back then, not politics, how do I say it? Your way of interacting with people how do I phrase it? If I had more alcohol, I could probably phrase it much better or worse. Your way of interacting with people set the standard for how you were going to be treated. And he was really tough to be around. Although on a battlefield, fantastic. Talking to him personally could drive you insane. Was insulting at some points. Was just difficult. Hey, no. And unfortunately for him, he had to deal with people outside of the military world, in the political world, who dealt with giving you a raise, giving you military promotions, and he rubbed them the wrong way because he didn't play the game, if that's a fair way to say it. He didn't know how to play the game. Not everyone does. I probably couldn't. But he didn't know how to play that game. the backslapping, the getting along to further your career. Completely unrelated, somebody who knew how to play that game, definitely down the road, Dwight D. Eisenhower. Trying to record here. He knew people. He got along with people. And he found certain people along the way in his career that looked at him and was like, okay, this guy's good. And he's reasonable. I can get along with him. And they would help move him forward. Not like nepotism, because he was qualified. I mean, obviously, Dwight Eisenhower was clearly qualified. But these people saw something in him, and he had this ability to interact with people that didn't turn you off. Arnold was completely opposite. He turned you off when you talked to him, but you were looking at him going, damn, he's a good fighter. But unfortunately, those people didn't see him on the battlefield. They just saw him, and they didn't like him. And unfortunately for him, those were the people he had to impress. And he didn't. And then the other side of it is the traitor aspect. And that is unforgivable. Be right back. Okay. Sorry about that. Back to the video.
By 1781, British successes in the South and Arnold's defection threatened Washington's home state of Virginia. Governor Thomas Jefferson, whose own home at Monticello had been occupied by Arnold's men, urged Washington to lead his men south to defend his home state. Though the American commander was anxious about the fate of his beloved Mount Vernon and had sent a division under Lafayette to confront Arnold in Virginia, Washington preferred to keep his men in New York and believed the decisive blow against the British would fall there, though his French allies planned an operation in the south instead. By mid-August, Washington abandoned his designs on New York when he received news that a French fleet of 29 ships under the command of Admiral de Grasse had set sail from the West Indies and intended to land a force of 3,500 men on the Chesapeake in early September. Washington had also received news from Lafayette that Cornwallis had retreated to Yorktown, located on the eastern tip of the Virginia Peninsula and surrounded by water on three sides. Washington and Rochambeau hurried south in an effort to trap Cornwallis and force him to surrender. By the beginning,
We're going to stop it there. Go back another 5 seconds. And we will finish out with pretty much the end of the battle. The Washington presidency in 1 hour, though, just does not cover the presidency. It covers everything. That means they have 23 minutes to cover his presidency. All right. We're going to end it here. I hope you've enjoyed so far. So until the next time, have a good day, have a good night. That's the correct button.